Okay, so on to narrative 3. From 1619 to today. And yes, this is about US history and the powerful moving of the Holy Spirit, 400 years divided into 130-ish year chunks. There are competing ideas on the history of the US that are, simplistically put, either good or bad, symbolized by the competing 1619 and 1776 schools of thought. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I'd like to propose that we're to reconcile these points of view and realize more fully how America's history is both, with both horrors and glories. I heard one smart historian give some praise to the 1619 project, but at the same time wanted to dispute the notion that slavery is so central to American history. But it is. Race is central, plainly. But furthermore, property is central. There is an important historical factoid that America is a nation of second sons, people driven out of Europe from unjust hereditary systems where only the firstborn enjoyed inheritance. Our brazenly hypocritical notions of believing that we could take land and remove others from it, people who predated us by a long, long time and then also own people and make them do all the work, is central to American history. These are ideas about property, and it is consistent with the American dream today still being centered on home ownership. Also fundamental to America's beginnings is religious freedom, with Puritans coming over seeking the freedom to worship God as they felt led. Their connection to Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil War is a rich area of study and ultimately linked to what was covered in Narrative 2, the execution of Charles I and the undoing of the divine right of kings. I would contend that the Holy Spirit, working in each of us individually and within our fellowship, demands freedom of religion. But, then, it's imperative that this applies to everyone, highlighting the divinity in all of us, endowed by our Creator, not just one or some. There is a powerful notion, too, of distinguishing not just between the American and French revolutions as referenced previously, but also the distinction between the words revolution and reformation. Revolutions that occurred politically and the reformations that occurred religiously are interestingly related. Many Catholics reject the notion that the Protestant Reformation is a reform, saying Luther's move was a revolution, away from true Christianity. Understanding Luther's sola scriptura and our American devotion to sola constitutiona and the rule of law is helpful. And it is bigger than just Americanism. It's very much a part of kingdom building worldwide and the reconciling work of advancing human freedom. From this foundation we have the complex beginnings of American history. We need to reconcile ourselves with our founding colonialism and the injustices of land dispossession and slavery. So we need to know those stories. Simultaneously, there were also countervailing Enlightenment ideals developing that have become what is recognized, pretty much, as a global rule of law based on human rights and the consent of the governed, or modern democracy. That this rule of law cannot abide the injustices of colonialism is a remarkable dichotomy. From that gnarly beginning, our American story really gets going in 1776 and the American experiment begins in earnest. This was revolutionary, and on a global scale. But paradoxically one committed to the checks and balances on leadership that is to go towards forming an ever more perfect union. Which is reform. Revolution to reform. It was then cemented, for over 200 years, when the most prominent revolutionary figure, George Washington, established the precedent of giving up power willingly, rejecting the notion that he was indispensable. King George acknowledged Washington was the better man. That said, it's also vital to know that Washington's guiding principle in this historic moment, his favorite passage of the Bible was from Micah 4, wanting to go home and sit under his own fig tree and vine, fearing no man. It's very nice, admirable, worthy of study, worthy even of being featured in a Broadway rap musical. But it's also important to note the reality, that the very people who actually tended Washington's fig trees lived in fear of him. This is a tension that must be reconciled. These are stories that must be told and understood. And so it was, this new union plainly struggled, conflicted over who this fundamental equality applied to, proceeding towards what some called an inevitable civil war, a war that is very arguably still raging. To clarify difficult and complex problems, I made the point in Narrative 2 that the Civil War is perhaps most easily understandable from a global point of view. Lincoln is telling them that democracy shall not perish from the earth, and that it depends on all people's freedom being recognized equally. Revealingly, though, in perhaps my favorite anecdote in American history, Lincoln didn't particularly care what those monarchs or any other white person thought about his work. But he did care about what one person thought. Frederick Douglass. Oh, to have been a fly on the wall when Lincoln asked Douglass what he thought of his second inaugural address. Douglass called it sacred, by the way. Now, after a period of immense progress, any good story needs a point where all seems lost, and I would contend that moment for us is Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. The idea that separate can be equal is fundamentally and fatally flawed, based on immature and self-serving reasoning that flies straight in the face of our founding principles. But justice couldn't be denied, and Thurgood Marshall just 60 years later did the heaviest lift, finally legally establishing that separate is not equal, with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. The more perfect union commitment we are founded on is undeniable, and true freedom paradoxically connects us all. Certainly the work of so many others in the civil rights movement courageously furthered all this, as well. Dr. King famously articulated these ideals at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, but Thurgood Marshall's role in U.S. history is massively underappreciated in my view and needs to be known by every American. From Brown we then proceed inexorably towards 2008 and the historic election of a man who just 150 years prior could have been enslaved. Whatever the politics, it is important to acknowledge this historical event. And then also reconsider the pushback. Because that pushback is more historically significant than seems understood at this point. It has always been there, but it has also swelled since 2008, very arguably culminating on Jan 6, 2021 with what is at least arguably an undemocratic break from the peaceful transfer of power, the fundamentally American precedent set by none other than George Washington himself more than 200 years ago. It remains to be seen what we're going to do about it. To the extent anyone might call this divisive of me, it's not. Let the rule of law fully explore that day, and if a jury agrees it was above board, then that's the verdict. But it must be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, what our rule of law is founded on. The truth, indeed, is what will set us free. We live in this era of cries of fake news and basic disagreement over what is true or not. It is somehow perplexing to thought leaders what to do about it. We have to be submitted to telling the truth and then relying on a jury of our peers to serve justice. That is the best we can do, this side of glory, towards God's perfect law of liberty. Disagreement and dishonesty is ripping the world apart, and will continue to. There's no stopping that. But we are still called, commanded even, to try, first looking at the planks in our own eyes, and then try and be peacemakers. And we ultimately may well have to rely upon a sense of peace that surpasses understanding. Doing that is easier said than done. But it is doable. And I have one more video suggesting the ideal way to enter into the conversation in the first place. It's about the fruits of the Holy Spirit, and opening yourself to truly rely on that same Spirit. It's just a click away. Thanks for listening.